tank warfare, or combined arms warfare, as we call it, takes a lot of training. When I trained my regiment to do this, it took over a year. The Russians are only taking days or weeks to try and train these forces. Therefore, they're just not effective. And now that the Ukraine army is well organized and has capabilities, it's been able to pick off these forces and prevent them making any ground. And I don't think there's any prospect in the future. There's lots of talk about Russia massing forces for some big attack, but that seems to be information coming out of Russia, not the reality. It occurs to me, or it's apparent to me, that Ukraine pretty much has a good intelligence picture of what the Russians are trying to do. And if they do try and amass a force because it's poorly trained, it's very unlikely to be effective and very likely to be taken down, as you've described recently with the attacks in the south.
Also, let's cover ceasefire talks. Another round of these discussions will take place in London this week. Also, according to Bloomberg, the United States is ready to recognize Russian control of the Ukrainian region of Crimea as a part of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. What is your assessment of the current stage of ceasefire talks?
Well, it's very difficult to sort of unpick all the information coming from both sides. And no doubt, there's a lot of disinformation we know coming out of Russia, and there are a lot of confusing messages coming out of Washington. Now, no doubt the talks this week, or I think tomorrow in London, will be very important way of going forward, and very much I expect with Britain and France leading the way militarily. As you said, there seems to be messages coming out of Washington that maybe a part of the peace deal would be that America would recognize Crimea as part of Russia, which might be the one piece that America thinks that Ukraine can concede. What it doesn't talk about is conceding any of the 4 oblasts which Russia has illegally invaded since 2022. And that is very, very significant as well. So maybe it's the start of some sort of negotiation deal. The Americans have also said, which the Russians seem to be keen on, that Ukraine could not join NATO in the foreseeable future. And I think that is something that one sort of expected. And the Americans have also said there may be ways round providing Ukraine defense security without being members of NATO. Yeah, it strikes me as a military person, actually, if Ukraine became a member of the European community and the European Defence Force, then that would be a pretty good sort of defensive network to be part of, just short of being part of NATO. So lots being talked at the moment. I think a lot is happening this week. And I think by the end of the week, we'll have a much better flavour of where exactly everybody is. But I think it's far from all in the Russian court and the Russian moving forward. I think actually that hopefully by the end of the week, we'll be in a position where the Ukrainians have the full support of the Americans, as they already do, all the European countries, and will be in a strong position to start any peace and ceasefire negotiations with the Russians. Conversely, I think things are stacking up against Putin, and it's very difficult to see where he can go from here, except for around the negotiation table for peace. And if Crimea is the cost of that, then only the Ukraine people will judge whether that's something that they are prepared to discuss.
It is interesting that Russians are demanding, also would like to see United States recognizing control over the 4 regions of Ukraine. As you just mentioned, Vladimir Putin would like to see the US to recognize occupied territories as Russian territories. However, we haven't heard and we haven't read any kind of reports that could suggest that the United States was ready to do so. Does it mean that as the American team, Trump's administration is not ready to give Vladimir Putin all what he really wants?
Well, it's very difficult to say without being part of that team. They do sort of change their view quite regularly, and it can be quite confusing. But I think it is telling that what we have heard is the no NATO point, which I think we were all expecting, and we have heard the Americans talk about Crimea. I suppose it's equally important that we haven't heard them talk about the 4 occupied oblasts, and I expect that is of more concern in the Kremlin than it is in Kyiv and Western capitals. But really, until we see the next round of negotiations and until we see what's coming out of the White House this week, it's difficult to tell because things have been so confusing, and it would appear the Americans themselves are having some difficulties. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, seems to be in some sort of bother, and we're not sure whether he'll still be in his post at the end of this week. But Trump has said that he expects a peace deal to be signed this week. And let's hope he puts his full effort behind making that a reality.
And also, let's also cover UK's nuclear deterrent. You just mentioned in your article for The Telegraph that the UK should start to produce also tactical nuclear weapons. Do you see the tactical nukes as the best option for the United Kingdom to deter Russia and to retaliate in case of attack?
Well, I think it's certainly something that Britain must consider, and we have a strategic defence review that is due to report very soon, and I hope they've considered it, because if America is going to get less involved in Europe, then the nuclear equilibrium, if you like, goes very much in favour of the Russians. It would leave just 2 nuclear countries in Europe, Britain and France, and although far smaller than the Russians know that there are enough strategic ballistic missiles to create, very severe damage on Russia. However, what is in complete imbalance is the tactical nuclear weapons. Britain gave up its tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons back in 1998. And although France has a few, there is the dilemma now that if Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine or maybe in the Baltic states, how Britain would respond. I think it's highly unlikely. In fact, I don't think Britain would respond with a strategic nuclear weapon. That there is very little we could do. And I think that is probably the assumption President Putin is making. However, if Britain and France had tactical nuclear weapons to be able to counter the Russians, I think that balance would be back more in equilibrium and the Russians more easily use it. I think the final piece on this, the tactical nuclear weapons are a way to generate masses of force on the local battlefield, far more than hundreds of tanks and everything else. And if you can use them with impunity, then Putin might consider it worth it. And there is a possibility that that could happen. So I would hope that Britain considers this and certainly gives something for Putin to think about, that actually it might be a sensible thing for Britain to re-establish its tactical nuclear weapon capability in order that Russia cannot use its tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine or in Europe in general.
Is the United Kingdom capable of producing new tactical nuclear weapons?
Well, that is a very good question, and probably one that one can't answer definitively. But Britain has a long history in developing nuclear capability. There is the Atomic Weapons Establishment, where Britain's nuclear weapons are maintained and developed. So I wouldn't have thought with my own expertise that would be an insurmountable problem. And Britain still has capabilities like the F-35B fighter and has hypersonic missiles that these weapons could be put on. So it's not an easy task. I would accept that, but I'm sure if Britain put its mind to it, it could